On the morning of January 27, 1700, officials along the eastern coast of Japan recorded something that made no sense. A wave, several feet high, had rolled in overnight and flooded fields, damaged storehouses, and swept through coastal villages. That alone was not unusual. Japan sat, and still sits, in one of the most earthquake-prone regions on Earth, and its coastal communities were well practiced at reading the connection between shaking ground and incoming water. What made this wave impossible to explain was that nobody had felt the ground shake at all. No tremor, no warning, just a flood that arrived out of a calm sea on an ordinary winter night. For nearly 300 years, this event sat in Japanese records as an orphan, a tsunami with no parent earthquake anyone could identify. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, along a coastline that Japan's scholars had no way of knowing existed in any detail, an entirely different set of records was quietly preserving the other half of the story, not written on paper, but carried in memory, generation after generation, by the nations who had actually been standing on the shore when the ground gave way beneath them. It would take 300 years, a team of geologists and a body of oral tradition finally being taken seriously to put those two halves back together. This is the story of the night an entire coastline broke, and the people who never stopped telling everyone exactly what happened. Subscribe to the Historia Archive and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This channel goes looking for the places where a written record on one side of the world and a spoken memory on the other end up describing the very same night, and there is another one of these waiting for you the moment this ends. A wave without a cause to understand why the 1700 tsunami confused Japanese officials so badly. You have to understand how good their record-keeping already was. By the start of the 18th century, Japan had centuries of experience linking local earthquakes to local tsunamis, and coastal administrators routinely logged flood damage alongside any tremor that preceded it. The January 1700 event broke that pattern completely. Multiple villages along the Pacific coast of Honshu reported the same basic sequence: calm seas, then a sudden flood that damaged rice stores, homes, and boats, with no earthquake recorded anywhere nearby strong enough to explain it. Japanese seismic history is unusually well documented for this period, which meant researchers, centuries later, could be fairly confident that no significant local quake had occurred that night. And yet a tsunami plainly had. Something, somewhere, had generated enough energy to send a wave across an entire ocean. For a tsunami to arrive without a felt earthquake, its source almost has to be very far away, distant enough that the shaking never reached the people who eventually felt the water. That is the definition of what geologists now call an orphan tsunami, evidence of a parent earthquake that struck somewhere else entirely, leaving behind a wave as the only clue to where the parent might be found. The Japanese records were meticulous enough to preserve the date almost to the day. What they could never supply on their own was the location of the earthquake that had caused it. For most of the 3 centuries that followed, that question had nowhere obvious to go. The Pacific Ocean is enormous, and a subduction zone earthquake, powerful enough to send a damaging wave all the way to Japan, could theoretically have originated almost anywhere along its rim: Alaska, Kamchatka, the Aleutians, South America. Without a matching earthquake record on the other side of the ocean, the Japanese tsunami of January 1700 remained exactly what its name suggested: an event with consequences but no confirmed cause, filed away as one of history's quieter unsolved mysteries. The coast that Culden tried it down the answer. it turned out, was sitting the entire time along the Pacific coast of North America, in a region that in 1700 had no European settlements, no ships logging offshore conditions, and no written seismic record of any kind. The Cascadia subduction zone runs roughly 700 miles along the coast, from northern California up through Oregon, Washington, and into British Columbia, a boundary where one of the Earth's tectonic plates is slowly, relentlessly forcing itself beneath another. These zones build up enormous strain over centuries as the plates lock together and refuse to slip smoothly, and when that strain finally releases, it does not release gently. Modern geologists estimate that on the evening of January 26, 1700, roughly 1,000 kilometers of the Cascadia fault ruptured at once in an earthquake somewhere between magnitude 8.7 and 9.2, among the largest earthquakes the region is capable of producing. The coastline itself dropped by 1 to 2 meters almost instantly. Entire forests that had been standing on dry ground were suddenly at or below sea level, still rooted, already dying. Salt water working its way in around trunks that had no way to survive the change. And the same seafloor movement that dropped the coast sent a wall of water racing outward across the Pacific, the same wave that would arrive in Japan roughly 10 hours later, at a distance and timing entirely consistent with a source along the Cascadia coast. For a very long time, nobody outside the region had any way of connecting these two events, because nobody along the Cascadia coast in 1700 was keeping the kind of written civil record Japan had already perfected. What the Pacific Northwest had instead was a different kind of archive, no less precise in what it preserved, just far less familiar to the scientists who would eventually go looking for it. The evidence would have to be pulled directly out of the ground, and out of the stories the coast's own people had spent 3 centuries refusing to let go of. Ghost forests and a date hidden in the rings. The geological detective work began with something you can still see today if you know where to look: stands of dead cedar trees standing upright along the Washington and Oregon coastline, gray and bare, rooted in soil that used to be well above the tide line and is now regularly flooded by salt water. Researchers call them ghost forests, and for a long time their existence was a minor regional curiosity rather than evidence of anything specific. That changed when geologist Brian Atwater, working for the United States Geological Survey, began systematically studying these dead stands alongside buried marsh soils and thin layers of sand deposited across the coastal landscape, exactly the kind of layered signature you would expect from a sudden coastal earthquake followed immediately by a tsunami surge. Atwater's work established that the Cascadia coastline had dropped suddenly at some point in the past, killing these trees within a matter of months by exposing their roots to salt water they had never been built to tolerate. Careful analysis of the outermost growth rings on the dead cedars showed that the trees had put on a final full season of normal growth in 1699, and then nothing. No 1700 ring. No sign of stress leading up to the die-off, no gradual decline. Whatever killed them arrived quickly enough to end their growth almost instantly. Sometime after the 1699 growing season closed and before the next one could begin. That narrowed the Cascadia earthquake to a specific window, sometime in the winter following 1699, but tree rings alone could not supply an exact date, only a season. It was the meeting of 2 completely independent bodies of evidence. Japanese written records logging a precise date for an unexplained wave, and North American tree rings marking a precise season for a sudden coastal collapse. that allowed seismologist Kenji Satake and Brian Atwater to finally connect the two halves of the same event. The travel time of a tsunami crossing the Pacific from the Cascadia coast to Japan is well understood and highly consistent, roughly 10 hours for a wave of that scale and distance. Counting backward from the Japanese arrival time on the morning of January 27, 1700, placed the originating earthquake at approximately 9 in the evening on January 26, 1700 Pacific Coast time. Tree rings had given the season. Japan had given the date down to the day and nearly the hour. Neither record alone could have solved the mystery. Together they did. If a detective story that runs through tree rings, ocean crossing times, and centuries-old Japanese flood reports is the kind of history that pulls you in, take a second and subscribe, because this channel is built entirely out of investigations like this one, and there is more waiting right after this. What the coast had been saying the whole time here is what makes this story different from most solved geological mysteries. The scientific detective work supplied the date and the magnitude, but it did not supply the human experience of that night, because no instrument existed in 1700 to record what the people actually standing on the Cascadia coast went through. That part of the record had already been kept carefully, deliberately, for 300 years by the nations whose ancestors lived through it. Beginning in the 1990s, geologist Ruth Ludwin at the University of Washington began the work of formally compiling oral traditions from native communities along the entire Cascadia coastline, eventually gathering more than 40 distinct accounts from over 15 tribes and bands stretching from Vancouver Island down through northern California. Directly along the same stretch of coastline the fault line runs beneath. Many of these traditions share a recurring narrative structure involving a supernatural conflict between a great thunderbird and a whale, a battle so violent that the earth itself shook and the sea rose up around it. Read as pure folklore, that story sounds like myth. Read against the geology, it reads like a description translated into the only language available at the time to describe an earthquake and a tsunami arriving together. The ground's violence becoming thunderbird's fury, the ocean's sudden rise becoming the thrashing of a wounded whale. Individual community accounts get even more specific. Vancouver Island's Cowichan people preserved a tradition describing houses collapsing and landslides triggered by a great earthquake that struck on a winter evening, a detail that lines up precisely with the season and time of day the tree rings and the Japanese records independently point to. Along the northern California coast, Yurok oral history preserved an account describing a night when, in the words passed down through the tradition, the earth would quake and quake again and quake again, while the water flowed over everything. According to that account, people climbed to a hill wearing headbands made of woodpecker feathers, attempting to perform a dance that was believed to hold the earthquake at bay. It did not work. Looking down from the hill, they watched the water rise up and cover their village and the coastline below it entirely. That is not a vague folk memory of bad weather. That is a description of a specific coastal community's specific response to a specific night, preserved across roughly 300 years without the benefit of a single written word. And it lines up, detail for detail, with what geology says actually happened along that coast in January of 1700. What Billy Balch told James Swan of all the accounts gathered from the Cascadia coast, one stands out for how specific, how detailed, and how early it was actually written down. In 1864, More than a century before Ruth Ludwin began her formal academic survey, a man named James Swan was living at Neah Bay, Washington, working as an Indian agent and the reservation's first schoolteacher among the Makah. Swan kept detailed diaries of his years there, and in one of them he recorded a story told to him directly by Billy Balch, a Makah leader, describing an event passed down through several generations before either man was born. According to what Balch told Swan, the ocean at Cape Flattery first pulled back with startling speed, draining away from the shore. Then it returned, rising far beyond anything the people had ever seen, submerging Cape Flattery itself and continuing to rise until canoes were later found stranded in the branches of trees, left there by water that had climbed higher than anyone standing on the ground that night could have imagined. The flood did not stop at the coastline. Water pushed across the Watch Prairie, the low, flat strip of land connecting Cape Flattery to the rest of the peninsula, until it met the Pacific again on the far side, turning the entire cape into an island for as long as the flooding lasted. Many people died, and then, in a detail that almost sounds too specific to have survived a century and a half of retelling, the account states that the water stayed low, retreating and remaining pulled back for 4 full days, before rising again suddenly, without any accompanying swell or storm, until it covered every part of the land along the strait except the very highest ground. When Brian Atwater and other researchers eventually compared Balch's account, sitting quietly in Swan's 19th century diary against the geological signature they had independently reconstructed from ghost forests and buried marsh soils along that same stretch of coast, the match was, in the words used by the scientists who made the comparison, noteworthy. A tsunami's water level does not behave like a single wave crashing in and receding. Large subduction zone tsunamis frequently arrive as a series of surges separated by hours or days, water rushing in, pulling back, rushing in again as the disturbed ocean settles back into its normal rhythm, and the pattern of retreat followed by a delayed, swell-free final rise that the Balch account describes is consistent with exactly that kind of extended tsunami sequence, not the sort of detail a storyteller would be likely to invent from imagination alone. Geography matched too. Cape Flattery sits at the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula, precisely the kind of low-lying headland that a Cascadia-scale tsunami would be expected to nearly encircle. And the Watch Prairie flooding, described in the account, lines up with the actual low corridor of land that separates the Cape from the mainland. What Billy Balch handed James Swan in 1864 was not treated by scientists as folklore to be admired from a respectful distance. It was treated as a witness statement, cross-examined against the rock and the soil, and it held up. The warding built into the memory several of the traditions Ludwin's team documented preserve something even more valuable than a description of the disaster itself, a working piece of survival knowledge about how to recognize one before it fully arrives. Among the Hu-Art First Nation on Vancouver Island, one account describes ancestors noticing unusual, unsettling behavior in the ocean itself, and moving quickly to high ground before the water arrived in force. That detail matches a real, physically grounded warning sign of an approaching tsunami, the sea pulling back dramatically and unnaturally before the main wave arrives, a phenomenon caused by the trough of the wave reaching shore before its crest. A coastline that experiences this kind of earthquake repeatedly across generations does not need a seismograph to learn that lesson. It only needs people willing to notice what happened last time and willing to tell their children about it clearly enough that the lesson survives, being handed down 100 times over. This is not a uniquely Cascadian phenomenon either. In December of 2004, when a massive earthquake off the coast of Sumatra sent a tsunami across the Indian Ocean, the Makah people, sometimes called sea nomads, living along the coast of Thailand and Myanmar, recognized the same warning sign in the receding water and moved their communities to high ground before the wave struck, based on knowledge passed down through their own oral tradition. Almost no one in their communities died that day in a disaster that killed hundreds of thousands of people elsewhere along the same coastline. Inherited memory, it turns out, can function as an early warning system, provided the people holding it are still being listened to when it matters. What the memory got right. That the rocks could not, it is worth being precise about what each kind of evidence actually contributed to solving this mystery, because the honest answer is more interesting than simply saying oral tradition proved the earthquake happened. The geology proved that a massive subduction earthquake occurred along the Cascadia coast at some point near the turn of the 18th century. The tree rings narrowed that window to a single missing growing season. The Japanese records supplied the one piece none of the North American evidence could ever have produced on its own, an exact calendar date, because Japan happened to be keeping the kind of paperwork that turns a scientific estimate into a specific night. What the oral tradition supplied was different from all three, and in some ways rarer. They supplied the texture of the event itself, what it actually felt like to be a person standing on that coast when the ground stopped behaving like solid ground, what people did in response where they ran, what they believed was happening to them, and, above all, what they decided afterward was worth remembering and passing forward, so their descendants would recognize the next one faster than they had recognized this one. Geology can tell you an earthquake happened. Only the people who lived through it, and the generations who kept retelling what they saw, can tell you what it was actually like, and what to do the next time the ocean starts behaving strangely, if you want more of the moments where a culture's own memory turns out to hold real, checkable, scientifically confirmed history inside it. Subscribe now, because that is what this entire channel is built around, and the next one is only a click away. What gets built on a sleeping fault, the Cascadia subduction zone, has not gone anywhere. It is still there, still locked, still slowly accumulating the same kind of strain that released so violently on the night of January 26, 1700, and modern seismologists now treat that earthquake not as a historical curiosity, but as a preview. The geological record shows that a rupture of this scale has occurred along this fault repeatedly over thousands of years, at intervals that average somewhere around 2 centuries apart, which means the fault is now well within the window, where the next rupture is considered geologically due rather than merely possible. Current hazard models describe a full-margin rupture capable of producing an earthquake up to magnitude 9.2 along roughly 700 miles of coastline from northern California to Vancouver Island, generating a tsunami with waves that could reach 100 feet in the most exposed coastal areas. Federal emergency planning documents have projected casualty figures in the thousands and damage estimates in the tens of billions of dollars, numbers grim enough that when a 2015 New Yorker article laid them out for a general audience, it triggered a wave of bridge retrofits, building code reviews, and emergency preparedness funding across Washington and Oregon that continues today. Millions of people currently live and work directly above a fault capable of producing exactly the kind of event the Makah, the Yurok, the Cowichan, and dozens of other coastal nations independently preserved the memory of. Emergency planners along the Pacific Northwest coast now actively incorporate that oral record into public hazard education because those traditions turned out to contain accurate, specific, actionable information about what this kind of earthquake looks like and how people survived it. Information that predates every seismograph ever built in the region by centuries. That is a remarkable turn for evidence that for most of the 20th century, mainstream science would have dismissed as folklore unworthy of a place beside tree rings and Japanese tide records. It took a genuine international detective story, stretching from a coastal field site in Washington state to a 19th century diary at Nia Bay to centuries-old archives in Japan, to finally treat the coast's own memory as what it always was, an eyewitness account that had simply been waiting a very long time for anyone qualified to check its details against the ground. Thank you for watching. If a coastline can hold on to the memory of a single night for 300 years accurately enough to match tree rings and foreign shipping records almost to the hour, what else do you think is still being remembered out there, waiting for someone to finally check? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.